Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to look at smart objects and smart filters in Photoshop. When we're working images through Adobe Camera Raw, it does make sense to try to keep the image as a smart object for as long as possible. But we need to bear in mind that some of the filters and some of the tools of Photoshop are grayed out when we have a raw smart object open in Photoshop. So when we're working with an image which is a smart object created from Adobe Camera Raw, there are one or two limits. One of those we looked at was we cannot get to our artistic filters. So there is going to come a time when we need to remove the smart object status from our raw file. Now if we want to do that, it's quite a simple process. There's a couple of ways, but one of them is just to go to the top right of the layers and we can choose to flatten the image. As you can see, when we flatten the image, the smart object status is removed. I'm going to hit Ctrl and Z to undo that. If you had a multi-layer piece of work here and you just wanted to return this one to a standard layer, remove the smart object, then we can right click and we can choose to rasterize. There it is, rasterize layer, and there you can see the smart object status has been removed. From within Photoshop we can convert this particular image, which is now no different from a standard Photoshop or JPEG image we've opened up. We can convert that into a smart object by going to the layers menu at the top of the screen. Down here we've got smart objects. There you can see convert to a smart object. When I do that, we see a very similar thing appear over on the right hand side. That little symbol will drop into the bottom right corner. So we have smart objects, but we also have smart filters, but they amount to much the same thing. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to remove the smart object status from my kangaroo, and we'll reapply it using the filters. Filter, right at the top, convert for smart filters. This is one of those panels that will appear just to give you a bit of information, but we can tick it so it doesn't show up again. But let's just stop and read what it says. To enable re-editable smart filters, the selected layer will be converted into a smart object. Well, in our case, a smart filter, but as I've said, they are very much the same, and when we see the little icon appear in the bottom right, it'll look and react exactly the same too. Now I have demonstrated what I'm about to do here in another video, but it's a quick process and I think worth doing again. Let's demonstrate the difference between a standard image, such as we're seeing here, and a smart object, whether we create a smart object or a smart filter. I'm going to remove the lock here, and I'm going to use my shortcut keys of Ctrl T to bring up the free transform tool. Holding the Shift key, I'm going to drag the top right corner in to keep the image in register, but I'm going to make it extremely small, and I'll hit the Enter key when I've committed that change. Now of course, when we're working with our images, there are times when we change our mind or want to make a little change to the amount of whatever it is we've given the image, but here I've been a bit brutal to demonstrate the point. I want to return this back to its full size. I've changed my mind, so I'm going to hit Ctrl T once again, and we'll drag the toggles out to fill the screen to the position we was in a few seconds ago. And when I hit the tick on the options bar, you can see the quality of this image has been destroyed, because when I made the image very small, it actually discarded pixels within the image, and when we bring the image back full screen, you cannot replace those pixels. Let's do the same thing with a smart object. Now I want to bring this image back to the original, so here's a little tip that I use quite a bit too. If we touch the F12 key, it will always reopen our last saved version. So I've taken the image back to where we started. So go into my filters menu and convert for a smart filter. Control T to bring up the free transform tool. There's one of the differences which tell us we're working on a smart object, that crisscross from corner to corner. Hold the shift key, click and drag. I'll make this one even smaller and hit the enter key. Now I think you'll probably guess where we're going to go with this when I bring the free transform tool back. Of course, the smart object status allows all of the pixels to remain. So as we drag it out and hit the tick on the options bar, we're exactly where we left it. Now imagine putting together a montage with 6, 8, 10, as many images as you want. When you start to put the images together, you're never really sure how large they need to be, the position they need to be. Well, it's going to be a great advantage if we create all of the images in our montage as smart objects, because then if I reduce this image quite small on the bottom left and then decide it's going to work much better if I have it bigger and top left, then I can achieve that with no loss of quality. Now I've got on screen here an image you may recognize from one of the other videos. I'd like to remind you of the size of this image, and I can do that by going to the image menu at the top of the screen, choosing image size. We can see if we look at this in pixels that it's a high resolution image, 5600 pixels by almost 3500 at 300 pixels per inch. The problem we find when we start to apply filters is sometimes we've got actually too many pixels within the image for the filter to do a really good job. What I tend to do is to remove resolution in the images I'm about to filter. Now there's a couple of good reasons for doing that. The filters obviously have to work on the pixels within the image, and sometimes because of the high resolution images we're using, they can have difficulty resolving the filter effect we're really looking for. It appears on screen a bit too tight, if that's the right way to describe it, looking more like a mistake rather than a filter that adds charm and impact to the image. And secondly, we're moving away from photo quality anyway, so the number of pixels we have in the image isn't so vital. So what I'm going to suggest we do here is, with the resample box ticked, I'm going to reduce my resolution at least by half. If I change to inches just for the moment and I reduce the resolution to 150 for example, you can see up the top here the image size is currently 55.6. As soon as I adjust this, the image size is going to drop to 13.9, but the size of the image in inches is going to remain the same. So we've got less pixels, but that's going to be a plus when we apply the filter. Now there is something we need to bear in mind whenever we're about to apply a Photoshop filter straight from the filters menu. You have to remember that thousands of people before you have done exactly the same with much the same result. So it's probably better to try to be a little different when we add these filters. Now there are quite a lot of third-party filters made by other manufacturers like Alien Skin and Topaz Labs. They're all excellent filters, but of course they do incur a cost. But then you have a better chance of creating something a little more unique. So if we do want to add creative and artistic filters to our image, we need to start with the right image, and here I'm thinking about the content of the image. But of course, what defines the right image? Sometimes that's difficult to actually put in words. It's one of those things that we'll know it when we see it. if you can imagine doing what we're about to do here with a picture of a modern jet airliner, for example, it probably wouldn't work anywhere near as well. Let's begin by converting this image into a smart object. We'll choose the option in the Filters menu, Convert for Smart Filters, and there we can see the little symbol that tells us that's what we've got. I think we can go straight back into the filters now, and I'm going to choose Topaz Labs. Now, it's not my intention to demonstrate these, just to give you a little flavor of what they can do. Now you can see I've just installed this on my computer, so I'll close that down and I'll open this up to its maximum size. Up here I'm just going to click back to look at all the thumbnails, and I have a number of different options here, but I think I'll look at some of the ancient ones. There we can see the thumbnails, and as I select them they'll be applied to the image and I get my first view of what the filter is going to do. Now maybe we can use one of these, given that they do filter the image quite considerably. Let's think about this one. We do have the opportunity to select this as a preset, then we can make changes using the settings you saw a few moments ago. But the object of the exercise here is adding a filter effect and demonstrating smart filters. So I'm going to click OK and allow the filter to be applied. Now we can see that things look just a little different in the layers palette over on the right hand side. We appear to have our smart filter, but we also have a mask, and yes, it is a mask. If I select the mask and we see that familiar frame, and if you look over to the toolbox, black is my foreground color. If I pick up a brush here, and I'll just use the brush at its full intensity, both in flow and opacity, to demonstrate this, we do get the opportunity to mask away the filter we've applied in strategic areas. And because we're working on a mask, of course, we can always adjust it as many times as we wish. In this case I'm going to use my shortcut keys of Control Backspace to flood my background color. That's currently white, so it's going to set my mask back to where it started from. Those two keystrokes, Alt Backspace, which floods the foreground color, and Control Backspace that floods the background color, these are shortcuts worth writing down on a piece of paper in front of your monitor so you learn them, because they're those that we're going to use over and over again. Now I suppose the real power of our smart filter, one of the options we have you've seen demonstrated. I can make this image small, I can rotate it, I can do all sorts of things, but put it back exactly as it is now with no loss of quality. But the other thing I can do is to double click the filter, because the filter stays live all of the time. So if I double click the Topaz impression filter, we're going to go back into the filters to exactly where we left off. So here's where you can do some of the editing of the preset I've got, but of course if I change my mind and I wanted to try one of the others, then I can select it and I can change the filters as many times as I wish. Now I can also flood the mask with black. I'm going to select that and I'm going to use Alt Backspace to flood it with black. And if we just think what we've done here, we've used our smart filter to add the filter effect, but of course the mask now being flooded with black removes the effect entirely. But I can double click the mask and bring up the properties, and from within this I could adjust the density. So I could start to mix the two effects, the basic image with the filtered image. And there you can see already we're starting to get something just a little more unique. Now if I take the density right the way down, then we effectively return our mask to white, and if I take it right the way up, we're back to black. But I wanted to point that out because that sometimes has some good uses. But I'm going to return it to black. I'm going to close it down. I'm going to change this. I'm going to actually add my own mid-tone color. So if I go down to my color picker on the left hand side and click the black, I'm going to choose a midway section, just something like that, mid-grey. OK, and once again I'll use Alt Backspace to flood that with the mid-tone grey. So we've got a similar effect we had just a few moments ago. So what I was thinking of doing here is just bringing back a little bit more of the original image in a strategically strong position. Now to do that I'm going to need my mask selected, and I'm going to switch back to black and white. We can do that with this little icon just above the two, and I can switch them around so I can spray black. I'm going to pick up my brush. I'm using a soft edge brush, a basic brush as always. As you can see, I've got a large brush here. I'm going to use it with the opacity at 100%, and I do need my flow very low, probably about 5%. But don't forget too that we have a little button here. When I click it, it's like a little indent. When I touch it, it's as though it just drops in a little bit. And once I do that, I can change the flow with the numbers on the keyboard. So if I chose the number 1 key, I get 10%, all the way up the number keys to 9 for 90%, 0 for 100%. But if I want a midway point, like 5% or 3%, I just hit 0.5 in this case in relatively quick succession, and we can select it very quickly and easily, because all I want to do is just bring back a little bit more impact maybe in an area of the image which is compositionally strong, but I'm sure you can see potential to do something quite unique with our images using the smart filter and the layer mask. Now I'm looking at the picture overall, and I would like to put a little more impact into the picture. So I'm going to select my smart filter layer, and I'm going to open up my levels. I'm going to do that with the shortcut keys Control L, but you will find them in your image menu. And what I'd like to do is to just tweak the dark tones here a little bit and the mid-tones to give the image a little bit more power. And I'm going to click OK to that, and you'll notice that the levels have been added to the filter, which means I can go back into the levels. So let me do that by double clicking the levels here, but you will notice that it opens up into Topaz before it gives me the levels. So don't worry about that, it seems to be quite normal. Now the layer mask here will work exactly the same as any layer mask in Photoshop. For a start, I can touch the little eye and turn it off, and we go back to our original image, and I can click and turn it back on again. I can hold the Shift key and click the mask, and the mask is temporarily just turned off, so we see the filter effect. But I do need to hold the Shift key and click again to bring it back into play. We can also hold the Alt key and click the mask. That brings the mask into play on screen, and of course we can edit the mask while we see it like this as well, and that can be useful in certain circumstances. To bring it back, just click the little eye and it all comes back to where we left it. Now quite often when we add a filter effect, it goes quite well with a nice texture. Now we could add a texture much as we have here, but I'm going to suggest a slightly different way. I'm going to take you up to the layers at the top of the screen. We're going to select Layer New Layer. From the options that appear, I want to choose a different mode. I'm going to choose Overlay, and I want to tick this little box to fill the overlay with a neutral color of 50% grey. Now, if we're going to fill a layer with 50% grey, and it's going to be sitting on the top of the stack because that's where it's going to be created, you would think it would make this image disappear, but of course, because of the overlay blend mode, that's not what happens. What we can do on this layer is apply our textures and keep them independent of the image we're working on. But wouldn't it be a good idea if we converted this into a smart object or a smart filter too? So let's do that from the filters menu, and then immediately go back into the filters, down to texture and texturizer. When I was talking earlier on about sometimes when we filter an image, the image has too many pixels for the filter to work effectively, I think we've got evidence here with this texture, which in effect is a filter in itself. It's quite a fine weave here, yet it's at its maximum scaling. I can't make the weave here any bigger. Imagine how fine that would be if I work this image through as the original image with twice the resolution we have here. It would be so tight that it can often look more like a mistake than a charming texture. But let's just apply what we have here. We've got quite a high relief here. Generally speaking, I find most of the time when I'm applying filters, there are always exceptions of course, but most of the time I'm down around the 3s, 4s, 5s. I'll add a little more so we can see it clearly and click OK. Now let me zoom in just a little bit, and there you can see the delicate texture we have, and it doesn't look too bad. It works pretty well with the image, and I think if we printed this it would look pretty good. But of course the beauty of having our new layer, and of course having this as a smart filter, is that we get a mask should we wish to remove the filter in certain areas, but also we get the texturizer. I can double click, go straight back in and choose a different texture entirely. Now the burlap is a bigger texture, and you'll see the difference right away. Now we can go back into the texturizer and try one of the other ones. We've only got 4 here. Brick is not going to be suitable, but sandstone is quite nice, but you will notice I've got the setting up pretty high, and when I apply it here we don't see it that well until I just zoom in a little bit, but then you can see this also works quite well with this image. So this is experimental and creative work. We can't predict what's going to happen as we apply filters and as we go through the manipulation. So we need the flexibility of the smart filters and the masks. And what I've done here is I've saved this as a Photoshop file, which means I can open this image up next week or next year to exactly the position we have here. Now it's great to be able to do that because I'm looking at my image and I think I could make my priest maybe even a little more dominant. So I can now select my mask, zoom in, pick up black and my soft edge brush, maybe push the flow up to 10 or 20% just to speed it up a little bit, and maybe I could just bring a little bit more impact back into my priest, not entirely. I'm going to leave a little bit of texture there, and we'll hit Control 0. They're the sort of changes that we need to make and probably will want to make as we're creating work like this. We apply the sandstone texture, but then tomorrow we think, well, perhaps that's a little too fine. So I can double click, no sweat at all. I can try my burlap again, or I can go back to the canvas I originally had. The choice is mine. Of course, sometimes we may be in a position where even at this stage we want to move forward with maybe a flattened image. Well, as long as we've saved what we've got here, then it's quite okay, isn't it, to go to the top right of the layers and flatten the image to do the last bit of work you may want to do. For me, that may be a little bit of burning of the corners. I find they're a little bit weak for my liking. So I could pick up my burn tool. I could select probably mid-tones as the option. I'll push my exposure to about 10%. I'll drop the size of the image down so I can slip off the edge. But I could then choose to just do a little bit of extra work around these areas, because we're all going to want to choose something a little different, and I'm going along the edge as well, as you can see. And I'm just continuing until I think I've got it looking about right, and I think that doesn't look too bad at all. But I'll just pick up that zoom tool and we'll just zoom into the picture just a little bit so you can appreciate the texture a little more. Now, as I've said before, there are a great number of third-party filters out there, and some of them are extremely good. There's also a number of different textures that we can locate, usually by doing a search on the internet. Many of them are free to download. We can import them into Photoshop so we can expand the textures that we can use in our images.